Calling the meeting to order. Standing Committee on International Trade, 43rd Parliament. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, we are doing a study of Canada's efforts to reform the World Trade Organization. For witnesses with us this afternoon, we have the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food, Marie-Noëlle Desroches, Acting Executive Director, Markets and Industry Services Branch. From the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Don McDougall, the Deputy Director, Investment Trade Policy Division. John Layton, Executive Director, Trade, Remedies and North American Trade Division. Kendall Hembroff, Director General, Trade Negotiations. Colin Bird, Director, Trade Policy and Negotiations Division. And Darren Smith, Director, Services Trade Division. Welcome to all of you. We appreciate very much you taking the time this afternoon to come and speak to the committee and share some of the knowledge that you have to all of us. Mr. Hembroff, I think you're the one who's going to make the opening statement. And we have the floor, Ms. Hembroff.
Bonjour, Madame la Présidente. Je suis heureuse d'être ici aujourd'hui pour faire le point.
Good afternoon, Ms. Chair. I'm here this afternoon to talk about the reform of the WTO and under the leadership of Ottawa, the Ottawa Group. I'm joined by several colleagues from Global Affairs Canada. Colin Bird, Director of the Latin America and Multilateral Trade Policy Division. Darren Smith, Director of the Services Trade Policy Division. And John Layton, Director of the Trade Remedies Division. And Don McDougall, Deputy Director, Investment Trade Policy Division. First of all, allow me to begin by providing a bit of context. The WTO is critical for Canada because it governs trade relations between 164 members and provides a stable and predictable framework of rules and access market for Canadian companies accessing world markets, backed by a binding dispute settlement mechanism. Canada is a founding member of the WTO, which was created in 1995 and has a long history and a strong reputation as a committed multilateralist. In fact, members are reminded of Canada's contribution to the multilateral trading system every time they walk through the doors of the WTO Secretariat building in Geneva. Canada, in fact, donated the large wooden doors to the old ILO headquarters where WTO now sits.
Has faced an increasingly challenging environment, characterized by the rise of protectionism and use of unilateral trade measures. Beyond difficulties in concluding negotiations in a number of areas, current challenges include divergent positions on trade priorities, a lack of consensus on how to treat developing countries, an overloaded dispute settlement system, and a stalemate surrounding vacancies to the WTO's appeal mechanism. Such challenges put the credibility and day-to-day functioning of the WTO at risk. Against this backdrop, several years ago, Canada took up a leadership role to build support for reform of the WTO and to identify concrete initiatives aimed at reforming the organization. As one of the more visible examples of our contributions, Canada has been at the forefront of efforts to reinvigorate the WTO and is playing a leading role in the Ottawa Group, a group of reform-minded WTO members first brought together by then Minister for International Trade Diversification Jim Carr in October 2018. The group of 13 WTO members is diverse in terms of geographical representation and levels of development. It remains small to allow for meaningful exchange of views, but is meant to support broader discussion involving all WTO members. Since its creation, the group has met at the ministerial level 4 times, most recently in Davos this past January. One of the key achievements of the Ottawa Group has been its role as a sounding board for the exchange of ideas. For example, the group has identified ways in which to improve transparency for businesses, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, through more timely reporting and notification of new government regulations, laws, and/or measures affecting trade. Canada has also played a leading role in discussions on how to resolve the impasse in appointments to the WTO's appeal mechanism, also known as the appellate body, which is urgently the most pressing issue facing the WTO. Driven by concerns about the appellate body's functioning, the United States has blocked new appointments since 2017, such that as of December 2019, there is a lack of quorum, which means that appeals can no longer be decided. Under these circumstances, a member deciding to appeal a panel finding can prevent the resolution of a dispute by effectively appealing into the void and undermining the legal rights of WTO members. For a mid-sized country like Canada, this loss of recourse to binding dispute settlement has serious implications. We are an active user of the WTO's dispute settlement system and have been party to a total of 63 disputes since 1995. That's 40 as a complainant and 23 as a respondent. This situation has provoked some creative problem solving on the part of Canada. This past July, Canada and the European Union developed a bilateral interim appeal arbitration arrangement to allow for appeals between ourselves until such a time as the appellate body impasse is fixed. And then most recently in Davos this past January, Canada and 16 other WTO members built on the success of that arrangement by agreeing to work towards a similar interim arrangement that would apply between participating members until the appellate body is again functional. While Canada's priority remains to finding a multilateral solution to the appellate body impasse, these types of interim arrangements help safeguard our rights to binding two-stage dispute settlement with willing WTO members until the appellate body is functional again. Canada is also playing an active role in a number of ongoing WTO negotiations. Although the current comprehensive multilateral round of negotiations, launched in 2001 and known as the Doha Round, has reached a stalemate, negotiations continue on a standalone basis on several fronts. This includes negotiations to address harmful fisheries subsidies, which have reached a critical stage. Fundamentally, this negotiation is about helping preserve fish stocks for future generations. But systemically, it is seen by many as a critical test of the WTO's negotiating function. Members are striving to conclude negotiations in time for the next WTO Ministerial Conference later this summer, and Canada has made a number of active contributions, including a recent proposal on overfishing and overcapacity. Canada is also playing an active role on agriculture, and has recently sponsored a statement by the Cairns Group in January calling for the reinvigoration of discussions to eliminate trade and production distorting agricultural subsidies, which represents a key interest for Canada and Canadian agricultural producers who face a very unlevel playing field in trying to access international markets. Challenges to the multilateral approach to negotiations have also led members to pursue negotiations through plurilateral negotiations, which involve only subsets of the entire WTO membership. For example, willing members have launched plurilateral negotiations, or also known as joint statement initiatives, on e-commerce, investment facilitation for development, domestic regulation for services, and micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. These negotiations have the potential to deliver significant benefits for Canadian businesses of all sizes, and Canada is actively participating in each. Due to external circumstances related to COVID-19, the ministerial meeting of the Ottawa Group that was scheduled to be held in Ottawa on March 18th has been cancelled as of a few hours ago. Efforts will continue on how best to plan our work in the lead up to the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference in Kazakhstan in June. A key priority for Canada in the months ahead will be to deliver on a commitment made by the group in January in Davos to enhance its efforts to engage business and our citizens on WTO reform efforts. It is safe to say that there is almost unanimous support that the WTO needs to be reformed in order to ensure that the organization is relevant and fit for purpose for the 21st century. The challenge, however, is that collective agreement on precisely what that means remains elusive. Perhaps this is maybe a good note, Chair, to end my comments. And as you can see, I have a few experts that are here to help the committee answer any specific questions that it might have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hembroff, for questioning. Mr. Hoback.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here this afternoon. I'm glad to hear that your announcement on the meeting next week. I understand why that happened, and I think that's a responsible measures you've taken there. So hopefully we'll find a step to work around that, maybe through telephone conferencing or video conferencing, something like that, because the work you're doing, I think, is still very important. I just want to go back into the appellate body and the U.S. concerns around the appellate body. From what I understand, and I know enough to be dangerous here, so I'm going to count on you guys to educate me to a higher level, hopefully after this meeting. But a lot of the concerns that they had are justifiable concerns that go against the original intent of when the appellate body was set up. So, Obama was complaining, George Bush Jr. was complaining. Like, there's been not just one regime complaining about this scenario in the U.S., there's been many. So why is it taking so long, and why did the U.S. feel it has to take it to a head like it has now in order to get the rest of the countries around the table to actually look at this seriously? Can you give us some background on that, maybe a bit?
So, Chair, maybe I can start by giving a little bit of context in terms of the U.S. position on the appellate body. The U.S. concerns, I think, as have been cited by the member, are not new. We have been hearing for a number of years now concerns about the way in which the appellate body operates. I think that certainly any WTO member that has been involved in disputes at the WTO probably has some issues with some of the specific results of cases over the years. Certainly in a Canadian context, I can think of more than a few cases where we were disappointed with the way in which the appellate body took a decision on a particular issue. But I think what is important is that, notwithstanding the fact, I think that there are legitimate issues that do need to be addressed by WTO members in looking very critically at the appellate body and the way that it functions, both procedurally, but also in terms of how it handles certain substantive issues, is that there is a need for a constructive dialogue on this. And certainly Canada and other WTO members have been really ready to engage in discussions in Geneva in terms of trying to find ways to reform the appellate body. Yeah. We certainly see this as a very fundamental part of WTO reform. And in fact, this past year, New Zealand's ambassador to the WTO, Ambassador Walker, had launched a series of discussions that were aimed at trying to find a solution to some of the long-standing problems affecting the appellate body, including to address problems that have been identified by the United States, but also by other WTO members. Unfortunately, engagement by the entire membership was very uneven. And we did not see any engagement on the part of the United States on some of the specific issues that it has raised over the past.
So do you see the U.S. now, in light of the Ottawa Group being formed and progressing, moving forward in some of these issues, do you see the U.S. Possibly stepping in now and saying, okay, finally you're taking it seriously and engage? Because it's really tough to imagine any type of appellate body without the U.S. being involved, having any clout or any ability to really do anything. Is that fair to say?
So we feel that U.S. engagement is absolutely essential, and we have looked for every opportunity to be able to engage the United States, not just on appellate body reform, but on WTO reform issues more generally. And certainly when the United States is ready to engage, we will be there and we will be ready at the table. We have also tried through our network in the United States to be able to engage key thought leaders and businesses in terms of the kinds of things that will be required in order for the United States to be engaged in these discussions. Okay. Unfortunately, engagement thus far has been quite limited on the part of the U.S.
So how many Canadian cases are sitting there in front of the body right now that won't be heard or sitting in limbo at this point in time? We got 3 judges left, I understand, out of the 5.
I'm just adding it up.
Colin's figured it out.
I think Colin has figured it out. So we certainly have
even if it's a rough case.
Yeah. So we have a case on wine right now with Australia. Yeah. We also have a case on aircraft with Brazil. And then we have several cases with the United States, including involving softwood lumber. I would have to check on the total number of cases right now. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 8. But if the committee would like a list, we could actually provide a list of all of the active disputes.
Okay. I assume I'm out of time. Okay, then, so what happens in the scenario? Let's use softwood lumber, for example. You've got that case sitting there. It just sits there now until we figure out how to move forward, or is it actually still progressing and moving forward with the existing judges that are there?
Right. So, just in terms of providing a little bit of background to the committee chair, there are two levels of dispute settlement at the WTO. And so there's the panel stage, and then there's the appellate body or the appeal stage. At this point, cases that are at the panel stage are still proceeding as normal. The issue that we have run into now as a result of the impasse and appointments to the appellate body is that it is possible for a party at the time in which a panel decision is issued for then to appeal that dispute effectively into what we call the void, meaning that because there is not quorum to hear the appeal, the case does not progress further. And so that is the reason for why Canada and other WTO members have explored this parallel interim appeal arbitration arrangement so that those members that are part of that arrangement can use that appeal mechanism as opposed to simply appealing into the void.
So that's fine for the members that are part of this organization, but outside of that, it's...
Thank you very much, Mr. Holbeck. Ms. Badayan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I've been speaking with businesses, entrepreneurs, both large and small, and I wonder if you could speak to the impact that these impasses that you've described at the WTO have on our Canadian businesses. In particular, yesterday we got a question regarding non-tariff barriers and how we can move forward. And I know that we are in the middle of negotiations, as you mentioned, on a number of different issues at the WTO. And I think it's important for Canadians to understand why and how these WTO issues are important to us in a very real way.
So I think that's a very timely question, Chair. Minister Ng last evening chaired a dinner involving over a dozen Canadian business people to talk specifically about the WTO and their views on the current challenges that are facing the organization. And some of the key themes that emerged from that discussion include the critical importance of the WTO for Canadian business. The WTO, of course, governs the vast majority of our trading relationships, although Canada has a number of free trade agreements in place with some of our key trading partners, 14 FTAs in force with 51 countries. That still leaves another 100 plus WTO members that are not currently covered under any kind of preferential trade agreement. Businesses in particular in Canada have expressed concerns regarding the impasse at the appellate body and are deeply concerned that Canada's rights at the WTO are undermined by that impasse, in particular vis-a-vis the United States. We have also heard from Canadian business about the importance of ongoing negotiations in areas like agriculture, for example. E-commerce is another area that has been identified by Canadian business as very important and for which Canada is taking a very active role to try to bring their issues to the table. I think that many countries have taken the WTO for granted over the last number of decades and have put the bulk of their focus on negotiating bilateral and regional free trade agreements. But the importance of the WTO, especially for a mid-sized country, really cannot be overstated.
Thank you. And would it be possible, along the lines of what you were discussing with my colleague, for you to explain once a case goes into the void, for example, should any of the cases that are currently pending involving Canada, require appeal, or should we feel like we would like to appeal those decisions, what would our recourse be as at today?
So I think, Chair, the answer to that question depends on who the other party is in question. If the other party is a WTO member with whom we have some sort of interim arrangement in place, Canada would have the ability to appeal if we felt that that was in our interest under an interim arrangement. In the event that the case does not involve a party with whom we have an interim arrangement in place, there's also the possibility that Canada could seek agreement with such a member that neither of us would appeal. in the event of a panel decision. Failing that, Canada's other option would be to potentially seek dispute settlement under one of our existing bilateral and regional free trade agreements. And so, for example, all of our free trade agreements in place also contain dispute settlement mechanisms, including agreements like CUSMA, CPTPP, CITA. And so we would also have the ability, should we not have the ability to pursue a dispute from start to finish under one of our bilateral agreements.
And how does Canada's leadership of the Ottawa Group fare at the WTO? Is Canada's leadership viewed positively at the WTO on this issue?
Well, I may be biased, but certainly we've received very good feedback from all WTO members in terms of the role that we have taken. I mean, our objective has been, at least at the start of these discussions, to try to build support for WTO reform in order to make sure that the organization is still relevant. More recently, we have focused in on very specific issues. And in fact, that support comes from a number of non-members of the Ottawa Group. Certainly in the United States is well aware of our efforts through the Ottawa Group and has been very supportive of our efforts to date. China similarly has also been very engaged. The Ottawa Group is not intended to be a monopoly of ideas on WTO reform. In fact, in many cases, the group has welcomed proposals and presentations made by non-members of the group who also have ideas on WTO reform. It's really meant just to be a sounding board for any WTO member that has specific ideas that it wants to bring to the table.
Good.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Savard Tremblay.
Alors bonjour, merci d'être là, merci de vous être déplacé. Je vous invite à mettre vos écouteurs, mon intervention sera en français.
You might have to put on your ears. You're going to have to listen to the interpretation, perhaps. I listened to your presentation with great interest, and you're dealing with the what, the how, what to do, in fact, to reform. And to reform WTO, it's largely due to the impact of the inaction on the part of the Americans or non-participation, which are blocking the process. So I think we can go back in time, however, to the Doha round, where, or even the Seattle protests at the time. Perhaps the Americans never got over it, and you can see that we've tried again and again to relaunch, but another problem, yes, reform the organization, but in a sense, why? You say it's very necessary to Canadian interests, that we need an institution, an establishment that regulates world trade. But the world trade negotiations stemming from way back in the Marrakesh round, or even the 1947 trade deals, there's many different positions or orientations available. Are there any way to take a look at the major thrusts of this rather than in instituting minor changes and cobble something together? Through you, Madam Chair, thank you for that question. Very, very important, very direct question.
The WTO has not kept pace with the manner in which WTO or which trade has actually been conducted over the last decade or so. We do not have disciplines on electronic commerce, for example, which is increasingly a modality by which a lot of international trade is conducted. And so while Canada and other WTO members have, in many cases, been negotiating commitments on e-commerce in our bilateral and regional free trade agreements for the better part of 20 years, the WTO at this point has no disciplines in this area. Similarly, the types of disciplines that exist on subsidies, whether in areas like agriculture, industrial subsidies, fish subsidies. This is another area where the WTO, I think, has an urgent need in terms of updating the rules. So I guess I don't want my comments earlier on what we are doing in terms of WTO reform to suggest that we are looking at minor tweaks. In fact, I think we are looking at fairly substantive changes, both through the negotiations that we are undertaking, as well as in terms of some of the more procedural elements. I think maybe one point that I should make, which is very important, is that ultimately WTO reform is not something that will happen overnight. It is something that will take many years to accomplish and will have many moving pieces. So we do view this as a very comprehensive effort, but there are many different moving pieces that are part of it.
Donc, mais je repose néanmoins ma question.
Well, I'll reframe my question. Insofar as the thrust, the orientation that the organization has to have a number of rules or regulations respected, it's really based on free trade. Now, there are certain articles or clauses, a most favored nation, for example, or country of origin, have had perverted results, in fact. And the dispute settlement mechanism, Ontario has an energy program with local effect. And there's no minimum of employment locally. It has to be a local. Now, these run kind of counter, so there has to be an opening to try to perhaps challenge some of these processes. Reform, yes, but is it the right structure to begin with?
Thank you, Chair, for that question. As a country that is highly dependent on free and open trade, Canada is very much committed to maintaining the basic principles that govern the WTO. That being said, we have, as part of our commitment to making trade more inclusive for Canadians, but also globally, have put a fair amount of emphasis in terms of making sure that the kinds of rules that we have at the WTO do work for everyone. And whether that is developing countries, where we need to be looking at how we take into account development considerations in terms of rulemaking, whether that is small and medium-sized enterprises, including through the initiative that has been recently launched dealing with micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Canada has also worked very hard to try to bring greater awareness to trade and gender issues, and in order to ensure that we are looking at things through a gender lens. And so, as an example, Canada had led and championed an initiative in Buenos Aires on women's economic empowerment, which is really intended at ensuring that we are looking at trade from a gender perspective and finding opportunities to ensure that trade is made more inclusive. I mean, these are just examples of certain aspects where Canada is trying to ensure that, that we are making sure that trade does work for our population. And it is a work in progress where we can continue to consult with Canadians to try to find ways to improve on this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blakey.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask, I think it was assumed, or certainly at least was the fallback position of the Canadian government in the CUSMA negotiations, that the WTO provisions around procurement would vouchsafe Canada's access to U.S. government procurement. The U.S. has since said that they're looking at pulling out of those provisions. They also have legislation in place that restricts Canadian access to U.S. government procurement under the Buy America program. So I'm wondering if Canadian companies don't have any right to access American government procurement, what rights will American companies have and access will they have to Canadian government procurement? And are there any corresponding restrictions on U.S. companies bidding on Canadian government work? Not just the federal government, but provinces, municipalities, and other public authorities.
So we are also very concerned by reports that the United States may be considering withdrawing from the WTO government procurement agreement. This is an agreement that means a lot to Canada and to Canadian business in terms of ensuring reciprocal rights for government procurement access. We are following these reports very closely. And should the United States take action to withdraw from this agreement, it will be one where we will have to look very closely at what our options would be. The access that is available to WTO members under that agreement applies to members of that agreement. And obviously, given the implications that CUSMA, when ratified, could have for Canada in terms of our government procurement relationship to the United States, any withdrawal by the United States from that agreement could be very serious in terms of implications for Canada. And so, as a result of that, we are working very closely with provinces and territories to ensure that if the United States does withdraw from the agreement, that we have recourse through our own mechanisms.
Now, currently under the original NAFTA and under the WTO, it seems to me that Buy America has restricted Canadians' access to U.S. government procurement. I know, New Flyer Industries produces diesel and electric buses. They have manufacturing facilities in Transcona, among other places, but they've been losing jobs as the U.S. content requirement under Buy America goes up for their buses. I mean, how is it if the principle is reciprocal access? I'm not aware of U.S. companies being under any obligation of any kind really to have jobs in Canada in order to get access to Canadian government procurement. Why is it that despite all the boosterism about the WTO and NAFTA, that Buy America persists and the Canadian government hasn't taken any real action against these measures that clearly contradict what are supposed to be the benefits of free trade for Canada?
Yeah, we have expressed concerns over the years for a variety of different types of Buy America measures. These are obviously measures that can and do have very significant implications for Canadian business. And so, when measures have been proposed or enacted, we have sought out opportunities for us to be able to raise these kinds of concerns using a variety of different channels. We typically try to start through advocacy.
Have you ever challenged them formally, either under NAFTA provisions or at the WTO?
We have not, although that option is there for us should we decide that is a route that we want to take.
If I do have a little bit more time.
2 minutes.
In your opening remarks, you talked about a number of committees that are doing work for modernization of the WTO, and you mentioned a committee on domestic regulation for services. I'm wondering what is being discussed at those tables that would differ from the status quo, or what would be the purpose of new rules, and what would they be trying to achieve?
I'll ask my colleague chair, Darren Smith, who is the lead for domestic regulation, to answer that question.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. Quickly, I guess it's basically us trying to establish minimum standards with respect to domestic regulations in the sense of transparency and process-oriented matters. So these are all the types of rules that would provide the kind of standards we have in Canada with respect to, again, transparency and process-oriented matters for companies. So
would those rules foresee enshrining the precautionary principle, or is Canada arguing for the approach that was taken in CUSMA?
Yeah, this is much more basic. This is more about looking at licensing and certification matters and trying to ensure that the regimes that for the members of the WTO provide a minimum standard of treatment with respect to these types of procedures. So, for instance, if you are in a professionally regulated sector and you're looking to export your services to another jurisdiction and you have to apply for a license in order to provide that service, there are certain rules in place that we're going to achieve, hopefully through this agreement, that will allow that service supplier a higher degree of confidence that their application is being processed and regarded in a similar manner to what you have in Canada. So it's basically an outcome that we hope will raise the standards in other jurisdictions, because in Canada we already have a very high standard in terms of openness in this regard. So it's a matter about putting our service suppliers in this case on a much more competitive footing with a wider range of WTO members. This is also a plurilateral initiative. It involves about 60 WTO members. And so it's not obviously as the ideal situation would have this to be a fully multilateral arrangement, but we're certainly moving the bar forward in this instance.
Mr. Smith, can I just ask the members if they could keep their earpieces away from the microphone? It seems to be creating some friction there for the translators. Thank you. Mr. Carey for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I want to thank all the witnesses for being here and for your commitment and experience in this file. I'd like to dig down on a couple things that have already been mentioned. The Buy American clause that was pointed out by a company, I believe it was IPEX, came here during the CUSMA witnesses and said how, one of the things that Mr. Harper was able to do is get a Buy American exemption. I believe in the new CUSMA, Mexico had a Buy American exemption. However, we failed to get a Buy American exemption. We've been aware for some time that the Americans are not engaging at WTO. And some people see it as a big opportunity lost by not using leverage that we had to get this exemption that we've had in the past. I was wondering if you could comment, maybe Colin, if you spent a lot of time in the U.S. there, why is the United States not engaging in the WTO? What are their big issues that they want to have resolved?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The U.S. issues with the WTO are long-standing on the dispute settlement side. Mm-hmm. They have had these issues that are notably around the issues of trade remedies. And frankly, that is a complication for Canada because we are often finding ourselves on the receiving end of U.S. trade remedy measures. And so when you look at the cases that they really complain about at the WTO, it tends to be around public bodies and state-owned enterprises, mm-hmm. Where there is a lot of common concerns that Canada and the U.S. have. But much of their concern has been around the area of how their trade remedy system has fared at the WTO. And some of those cases are Canadian.
And that, so this is the reason they're giving for not engaging right now?
They're not really giving a reason for engaging. They are indicating that they would like the membership to share the same views that they have about the overreach at the WTO. And the challenge is that any time a legal question is put before the WTO, there is a winner and a loser. Mm-hmm. And so finding agreement that the interpretations of the AB are inconsistent with the covered agreements is very challenging to do.
All right. You mentioned the softwood lumber dispute, and I remember being the parliamentary secretary to industry back in 2006, 2007, when we were working on resolving it. And I remember it was the Honorable David Emerson working, and we were able to have that resolved. Again, with this CUSMA, back in 2016, I believe Mr. Obama was here in Canada, and one of the things he wanted us to do was to sign on to the original TPP, which you guys mentioned was a important part of multilateralism. Unfortunately, we didn't sign on to that agreement, and the softwood lumber dispute is still ongoing. Again, we were hoping that we'd have some leverage with the CUSMA agreement, and really nothing came of it. What was our record with the WTO when we actually got it in front of them for our softwood lumber disputes in the past?
So, Chair, unfortunately, we don't have that information handy, but we'd be happy to provide it to you over the coming days.
All right. That my understanding is we were always quite successful when we actually got a hearing. My concern again for if we lose the WTO, we didn't address it in CUSMA. Would you be able to give us an opinion on then what would our options be? How can we resolve these issues if the Americans are not being active in these agreements? Is it through U.S. courts? What can our companies do if they're feeling they're not being treated fairly?
So I would love to be able to answer that question. And in fact, there's another committee that is currently discussing softwood lumber as we sit here now. So unfortunately, we don't have the appropriate expert to be able to answer questions around how we might handle softwood lumber, given the various scenarios that you've outlined. So maybe what I can suggest is that if the committee is interested in hearing more and having a discussion around softwood lumber, I can certainly suggest someone that you may want to call as a witness.
That and Buy
Thank you very
American,
much.
even if you
Sorry,
could send
Mr.
it to us, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. Mr. Raya.
I would like to ask Mr. Hambro on. I've heard some reports, though I don't know whether it's a fact yet, that US is considering withdrawing the government procurement from WTO. As we know that under the new NAFTA, Canada and US, we have left that portion of the trade to be considered under WTO. So what are the chances that US will withdraw its government procurement from WTO, and if it happens, what remedies we have?
So maybe just building on an earlier discussion, I'm not sure what the chances are that the United States might withdraw from the government procurement agreement. I mean, there's ultimately a decision that will have to be taken by the U.S. and presumably in consultation with its key stakeholders. Certainly, should that come to fruition, or should we perceive that to be a real risk, that is something that we will have to take very seriously, and we will endeavor to engage with U.S. interlocutors at every opportunity to try to clarify their specific position. Ultimately, I'm not sure how that will play out, but that is something that we would be studying very carefully.
The non-tariff barriers, practiced on Canadian exports by India, Korea, Japan, etc. How do we fight that?
So non-tariff barriers can come in a lot of different forms. We have certainly had the opportunity through a number of our bilateral and regional FTAs to try to be able to tackle non-tariff barriers in a lot of different ways. And that can be through very comprehensive provisions in areas like technical barriers to trade or sanitary and phytosanitary standards. It can be about improved transparency measures. We have taken a very similar approach to the WTO. In fact, the WTO agreements do contain a number of provisions that already are designed to try to address a variety of different non-tariff barriers. One of the biggest problems that Canadian business reports to us as being of concern actually is the lack of information and transparency about government measures. And in fact, Canada and other WTO members have been working really hard to try to improve the compliance record of countries when it comes to notifying measures that are either under review as something that could be put in place, or in fact measures once they're put into place. Unfortunately, a lot of WTO members, especially developing countries, have not had a particularly good compliance record. And so part of what we've also been doing is working with like-minded countries to try to find ways where we can help developing countries in terms of better compliance. And that would go a long way in helping Canadian business that are struggling with these NTBs in a lot of markets.
US President Trump has stated that countries like China, India are no more developing countries, and that we have to have a relook on the preferential treatment they get, which I tend to agree with. What is that can be done on that?
So Canada takes a very pragmatic view on development at the WTO. The United States, I think, has rightly pointed out that There may be some countries that have long claimed developing country status that
but India is fifth richest on GDP basis and is 126th on the per capita income basis.
Indeed. I think our view, though, is rather than getting into a lengthy and protracted debate on what criteria we should use in terms of identifying a developing country as such, is that it is better through the various negotiations that are underway at the WTO, whether it is e-commerce, negotiations on fish subsidies, agriculture, but to identify the specific types of flexibilities that may be needed for certain developing countries in a unique
You mentioned
context.
agriculture. Canada is big in agriculture export, and India, because it is classified as developing countries, has got some advantage on agriculture subsidies it provides. What is the remedy for us?
So there's no doubt that when we started out having agriculture discussions 20 years ago, that the big subsidizers are not the same that we see now. Countries like China and India are certainly in that top tier of countries that heavily subsidize their agriculture sectors. And so a really key interest for Canada and a number of other WTO members is tackling those trade distorting agricultural subsidies. The reality is we can't compete, and nor should we. Those types of subsidies really do unduly distort trade and are a significant problem for Canadian agricultural producers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewis.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you. That was very informative presentation, so I appreciate that. I'm just going to ask you some very simple questions because you got my curiosity up. So here we go. How many members did you mention are part of the WTO right now?
164.
164. And of all of those members, member countries, are they all in agreement that there should be reform of the WTO?
Yes, I would say that is true. Certainly when we started this discussion maybe 2 years ago, I'm not sure that everyone would have been of the same view. But I would say, yes, there is wide consensus that WTO reform is required, but there are very different views in terms of exactly what we should do and where the priorities should be.
I can appreciate that. How long has it been in discussions for? A couple of years, perhaps?
I would say roughly. We put out a discussion paper in September 2018 that was not necessarily the beginning of discussions on WTO reform, but it was at that point really that discussions began to have momentum.
Okay. Now, who would typically take the lead on something like this? Which countries would you expect to take the lead, notwithstanding the fact that it sounds as though the United States may or may not want to be part of it? So, what does it look like to you?
Well, so Chair, I'm gonna just make one small comment, just to be clear. The United States is actually very much in favor of WTO reform. They're not members of the Ottawa Group, and we have not had a lot of engagement from them on reform of the appellate body, but there are actually a number of areas where the United States is quite engaged. So, for example, the United States has been a key proponent of improved transparency and notification provisions at the WTO. They've also been very active in discussions on development. So I just want to be clear that notwithstanding some of the discussions here, that the United States is quite active on reform. I think that certainly the countries that we have been working most closely with have tended to be more medium-sized countries who maybe don't have the economic might of some of the large players in order to be able to work outside of the WTO. And so we have, and this is a generalization, but have found a lot of success in working with countries like Norway, New Zealand, Australia, Chile, Mexico, but countries of a similar economic size and who have a shared and common interest in the rules-based system.
Great. So you answered one of my questions without even knowing it. And my question was about medium-sized countries. Would you consider Canada a medium-sized country?
I would.
So in the grand scheme of the WTO, Canada would be medium-sized. Timelines then, so I know you mentioned a couple of years going forward. So in the event that a reorg does go forward, what kind of timelines would we expect to see for this reorg to happen? And the second part of that question would be, if we push it off, what kind of ramifications, what what is going to tie our wrists together, perhaps. You understand what I mean? So how much time do you think it's going to take? And if we don't do something, what does that look like?
Right. I think it's all about incremental progress. So we have the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, which is coming up this June. And I think that is an opportunity to achieve some key outcomes that would push forward the needle in terms of WTO reform. So one of our goals for that ministerial conference is to conclude negotiations on fish subsidies. There's still a lot of work that has to be done between now and then, but we think that would go a long way in terms of delivering on a key negotiation that has been going on for almost 20 years. Similarly, the negotiations on domestic regulation for services are also getting quite close to conclusion. So that would be another key opportunity to modernize the trade rules. Other elements will take more time, and certainly those aspects, such as reform of the appellate body, will absolutely require engagement by all WTO members. Speaking maybe quite frankly, it is unclear whether or not the current U.S. administration will be prepared to engage on dispute settlement issues. So there may be other areas where we can make progress for now. But in terms of some of the issues related to dispute settlement that we've talked about, it could very well be that we're several years away still from being able to have those discussions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dhaliwal.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses. Arndeep and myself come from Surrey, British Columbia. Large number of businesses are SMEs. I'm going to ask you 3-4 questions, so then I'll give you all the time to speak. First is, what are some of the positive implications does Canada's trade policies and WTO policies have on SMEs? And do any of these policies create any challenges or barriers to trade for SMEs? And lastly, what are your recommendations to mitigate such challenges?
I think in answering that question, I would say that all of the WTO agreements have implications for SMEs. SMEs benefit from access to open markets, whether that is in terms of the elimination, reduction of tariffs, which can make their goods less costly in international markets, whether it is liberalization of trade and services, allowing SMEs the ability to, for example, provide services on a cross-border basis, for example, through electronic means. Rules on intellectual property are also needed by Canadian SMEs in terms of ensuring that their proprietary information is protected. But I think beyond that very general answer, I would say that we have been paying more attention to the particular needs of SMEs, because a lot of the things that I've just mentioned, I think would apply as well to large corporations as well. SMEs, in terms of the discussions that we have had with them in Canada, they tend to be especially sensitive to things like very burdensome customs and trade facilitation procedures, onerous paperwork requirements, unclear information regarding regulatory requirements in different markets. And so, we have tried to be very conscious of that in approaching our development of international trade rules. We, for example, are participating in a new WTO initiative that I mentioned in my opening remarks, dealing with micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, or MISMEs. And that initiative actually is designed to take a very close microscopic look at the particular kinds of challenges that MISMEs face in international markets, and to try to ensure that we develop WTO rules that are specifically designed for small and medium-sized enterprises.
Vince, you have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
If I may, Madam Chair, thank you. The appellate body was established in 1995, and now it's 2020. So I'm sure you and others have a lot of opinion and or recommendations to update it. However, we see that there is a Canada-EU interim arbitration appeal arrangement, as well as Canada's efforts to develop the multi-party interim arrangement. How do those align? How do they interconnect? And second question to that is, what do you see, or how do you see the updating of the appellate body moving forward?
So, in an ideal world, we would be in a position to begin new appointments to the appellate body, and would have a legitimate appeal mechanism by which WTO members could seek to appeal panel decisions. Because the United States has been blocking appointments now since 2017, that appellate body can no longer hear disputes. And so because of the potential impact of that for Canada in terms of disputes that we have ongoing right now, but also disputes that we might launch at some point in the future, it has been very important to us that we put in place some form of interim arrangement or arrangements by which we can ensure that we have some form of appeal mechanism. And so that has been the reason for why Canada had sought a bilateral arrangement with the European Union this past summer, and why on the basis of that, we are now engaged in discussions with 16 other WTO members to do something on a multi-party basis. That is really intended as a temporary solution until such a time as the appellate body is functional again.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay.
Alors, il y a quelques années, on parlait de...
A few years ago, we were talking about the implementation of services, and it dragged along quite a while at the WTO. We don't know where we're at yet on this particular agreement. Do you know where we're at?
In fact, the Trade and Services Agreement, negotiations. Apologies.
On va y arriver.
It's not me. It's not you. No. We're good? Okay. Now that we're all awake. The Trade and Services Agreement negotiations were effectively suspended in November, December 2016 with the change in administration in the U.S. A decision was taken by them to ask for more time to contemplate their position on this issue. And to this end, they have not actually sought the re-engagement of all parties in this process. And I think it was the preference of others, including Canada, to see if additional consultations and other discussions on this issue could proceed, and evidently that's not been the case. So the negotiations are suspended. They could pick up, but at this point in time, there's no specific date I could mention to state when this could potentially restart.
Donc là, actuellement, ça stagne et éventuellement, ça pourrait...
So it's stagnant, and maybe it'll start up again. E-commerce, you said that we haven't had anything quite modern or up to date right now. It's currently also under negotiation, apparently. Could we have a general idea? Because right now we're being dominated by a couple of very large e-companies, and they completely crush all competition, eliminating them in to all ends and purposes, trade. Digital companies today, the big three, are hegemony today. So from commercial or trade purposes, it seems to recur. And we see, well, sometimes they go over the line in some of their behaviors, but a lot of people are quite concerned about an eventual agreement that we're going to put more and more power into the hands of these major mega players in the digital world.
Find a way to get the answer to Mr. Savard-Tremblay.
Vous pouvez juste dire oui ou non, là.
Mr. Blakey.
Oui,
Well, I think we can find a resolution to that actually, because I'm interested in a similar question. I would just I would add to that question. You know, I mean, we just came off a study where we heard a lot about the new digital economy provisions in CUSMA and some of the problems with them. So, I mean, in addition to the question that was posed, what I'd like to know is whether it would be Canada's position in these negotiations to try and have the WTO rules reflect what we just negotiated in CUSMA, or are we looking for something better that's sensitive to a lot of the concerns we heard about what we finalized in CUSMA?
Thank you very much for both questions. I'm going to plug this just in case. So the WTO initiative on electronic commerce, and I'll define it a little more broadly as digital trade, because sometimes e-commerce is conceived to be a little bit more narrowly about, you know, online or goods bought and sold online. Here we are talking about something broader. However, the discussions are very much at an early stage. So the scope of our work, the legal architecture, some very fundamental questions are yet to be defined. But I would say that, like in all trade agreements, we certainly take into account what we've done in previous negotiations and learn from it, and try to find ways in which we can find new ways to support the interests of Canadian stakeholders. Indeed, one area that we're taking a look at very strongly is on the protection of personal information. We have a concept paper, in fact, and I should also mention that all of Canada's proposals are available on the department's website, so full transparency is definitely one of our objectives here. But coming back to my response, you know, on protection of personal information, here's an idea that we have to ensure that actors, governments don't misuse personal information collected from companies to discriminate against individuals who come from historically marginalized groups, whether that be from a basis of ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation. And so these are the types of things that we're bringing to the table that perhaps have not existed already in our bilateral FTA agenda. But bottom line as well is that the work that we're doing at the WTO on e-commerce or digital trade is also reflective of being very consistent with respect to our domestic regime. So we ensure that, at one hand, we're trying to maximize the commercial opportunities for Canadian enterprise abroad, providing for certainty and predictability when they're operating in foreign jurisdictions, but at the same time ensuring that the Canadian government has the continued ability to regulate in the public interest on a variety of issues that pertain to the subject matter.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cram.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today. Ms. Hembroff, in your presentation, you talked about the Ottawa Group acting as a sounding board for ideas and problems, and you also brought up the issue of the need to eliminate output distorting agriculture subsidies. So I'm wondering, has the issue of output distorting agricultural subsidies been limited to the Ottawa Group sounding board, or has that actually gone all the way to the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism?
Yeah. So, Chair, I think for this question, I do have an expert here who I failed to mention in my introductory remarks, Mary Noel from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So maybe I can let her talk about specifically what Canada has been doing in the agriculture discussions at the WTO.
Thank you. So in the context of the agriculture negotiations, Canada has been an active participant from the beginning of the Doha round in 2001, and disciplining trade and production distorting agriculture subsidies is one of Canada's priorities. So to that effect, we have provided significant analysis and have engaged with several WTO partners over the course of the years, and including on the way towards the next WTO ministerial conference in June. What Ms. Hembroff has referred to in her introduction is work that Canada has done with a coalition called the Cairns Group. It is a coalition of agriculture exporting countries. We talked a bit of mid-sized economies, so those are mid-sized economies that depend on agricultural trade, such as Brazil, Argentina, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada has co-sponsored a declaration by the Cairns Group that sets up a framework to find new disciplines for trade and production distorting domestic support in agriculture.
Okay, so I'm hearing that it has not gone to the dispute resolution mechanism. Is that safe to say?
So in the context of the negotiations, the objective is to improve the existing trade rules. What would go before dispute settlement would be based on the existing trade rules. The negotiations themselves are there to improve the rules. So in the Cairns Group framework, there is a common interest in capping and reducing the trade distorting domestic support entitlements that are given to WTO members.
Okay, so we haven't accused anyone of breaking the rules because the subsidies are not part of the rule set. Is that an accurate statement?
So there are current rules on trade distorting agricultural support, and there are WTO dispute settlement processes with respect to those. There is one involving China at the moment. So some WTO members have questioned the way China notified its trade distorting domestic support. So the current rules are also being part of domestic dispute settlement processes.
And so was it Canada that initiated the complaint, or was it another country?
Canada was a third party in that process, but it was not initiated by Canada.
Okay, and has that dispute been resolved, or what is the current status of that complaint?
I will need to verify.
Okay.
I think it is ongoing, but I will need to verify.
Okay, well then let's shift gears a little bit, because the issue of bilateral free trade negotiations came up earlier in our conversation. So I'm wondering, has Canada had at least high-level talks with the United Kingdom post-Brexit about a free trade agreement with that country?
So, Chair, this question is outside the topic of the WTO, but I can answer it if that is acceptable
Yes,
to the
please
committee. So, at this point, following the UK's exit from the European Union, we have agreed to continue to apply CITA, which is the agreement that we have with the European Union, until the end of the transition period. And so right now that transition period is set to expire on December 31st. Of course, it could be extended. So at this point, CITA continues to apply. We have not initiated discussions for a bilateral FTA with the UK, but that is something that we will continue to consider and will be dependent on developments.
So why haven't we had at least high-level talks on that matter?
So at this point,
a short answer, if you can.
Yeah, I can. So CITA still applies, and I think Canada needs to determine whether it is in our interest, as is the case when we decide to launch FTA negotiations with any trading partner, whether it is in our interest to do a bilateral agreement, and that's dependent on a lot of factors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cram. Mr. Sarai.
Yes. Can you tell me if the delays that the U.S. is causing on the appointment of judges or vetoing them is that causing the delay in the softwood lumber dispute resolution? Has it had any effect on that?
No, it has not had an impact on the specific pace of that case. If we have not found a solution to the appellate body impasse by the time in which that panel decision is issued, then we will be in a situation where it's possible that either Canada or the United States could choose to appeal that decision, at which point then it would essentially go into a bit of a void.
And if the new measures, the new appellate arrangement that you have with the European Union, if that was to come into effect and the U.S. was part of that, how would the appellate regime change or alter? How would it be better for those having disputes or challenges?
So the multi-party interim arrangement that we're negotiating right now, it is intended to, as closely as possible, replicate the current appellate body. So, we have not because we've been looking for a solution that we could put in place fairly quickly, it does not attempt to include improvements or deviations from the current appellate body mechanism. At this point, I think it seems unlikely that the United States, given what I've just said, would choose to join such an arrangement. If anything, the United States might, for example, decide to begin allowing for appointments to the appellate body. We wouldn't need an interim arrangement if the United States were prepared to continue with the current appellate body mechanism.
So the interim arrangement isn't any reform of the appeal mechanism. It is simply an interim arrangement of the existing model that we have, but being done with the European Union and others. So are there, going from that, are there any reforms being done to the appellate measures? What I find is that the process takes so long, coming from British Columbia, coming with riding with one of the largest softwood lumber employees in the country, to wait years and years and years, it really kills a lot of our industry. Unfortunately, a lot of smaller individual manufacturers go belly up, they get bankrupt by the time the resolution comes, and if whoever has bought their assets, they get the counter anti-dumping duties or whatever was enforced on them back, and by that time they're gone, or they don't have the ability to last that long. So is there any reform to make it more efficient, to make it quicker and bring resolutions front faster?
So one of the things that we have tried to talk about with the WTO membership is whether there are ways in which we can try to ensure that decisions are rendered by the appellate body within a 90-day period. Because we have found that over the years, increasingly, the types of discussions and analysis that the appellate body has undertaken have become quite complex. And that has actually in many cases meant that, in fact, it has taken more than 90 days for the appellate body to issue a report. And so we have looked at ways in which we can try to constrain that in order to try to ensure at least that the appeal process happens in a more timely manner.
Because the appeal process shouldn't be a tactical tool. And what I find when it comes to softwood lumber, it's simply a tactical tool. As soon as the agreement ends, it immediately is imposed, and immediately you go through this years and years and years of waiting period until it's an agreement reaches again, and then the cycle continues. So it should not be used as a method to just frustrate the system, and unfortunately in this case it is. So how are we doing, what are we doing to ensure that this is not used as a means where invalid or some disputes have some validity on both sides, and it's getting to the nuances or how they interpret it. And in some, such as this, I find that it's just simply used as a tool to really punitively damage our industry.
Yeah. And I mean, when the appellate body was created, it was never intended to be automatic. There's not a requirement that every dispute actually go to an appeal. The reason why it was created is that sometimes panels don't necessarily get it right. And so the appellate body was created in order to provide an overarching review process. In an ideal world, an issue, a irritant with a country would not even need to go to the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. When we have irritants with countries, whether it is issues like canola, for example, with China, or pulses with India, we do try for some time through advocacy and discussion and dialogue to try to avoid actually getting to the point of a WTO dispute. And in part that is because WTO disputes do take time, and they are very resource intensive as well. And we have sometimes had good success in being able to avoid having to go to a formal WTO dispute. So, I mean, that is another tool in our toolkit, and can be very successful in terms of resolving problems more quickly.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hoback.
Thank you, Chair. And just a few quick questions. In regards to agriculture issues, I'll use the example of India and the pulses. Again, here's an example where we know there's not a problem. yet it seems like there seems to be no remedy or no way to get a remedy on, even with the threat of going to WTO. So in the scenario that we're facing right now with the reforms that are ongoing, where does something like this fall? And is there any resolution in sight? Because it seems like as the resolution gets closer, then all of a sudden the willingness of that country to negotiate or find a settlement becomes stronger and stronger. So in that scenario, how does that look?
Well, it's a good question, and I mean every case is different, and the way in which we ultimately resolve these disputes can also vary. Sometimes a country may be motivated to resolve an issue because of a change in its domestic situation. It may be in response to pressure from their own domestic stakeholders. It can be as a result of a negotiated solution between two parties. So I can't really provide a general answer to that.
I guess what I always find frustrating or interesting is why wouldn't launch the dispute right away, knowing that it started the process, and then now that they know it started, wouldn't that be more incentive for them to actually create a negotiation? If you don't launch the dispute, if you don't launch the action, like Italy on pasta or durum, for example, or China now on canola, like until you launch it, they may not take you seriously. But once you launch it, then they take you seriously. And I think even like softwood lumber, until you launch it and get it close to resolution, well, then you won't take it serious. And I can even use the example of wine, with Australia taking us to the WTO on the excise tax. I'd like to think now that we're close to seeing that come to fruition, that we're actually going to take it serious and maybe negotiate something with Australia and some of these other countries on this. But, I guess I'm just trying to find out why do we wait so long to launch these appeals? Because like Mr. Serrera says, when you're in the softwood lumber industry or any other industry, that collateral damage in that period of time as you wait is so expensive and so damaging. It just creates a scenario where you can't recover. And I think a lot of countries know that, so they just stall it, knowing that the competition will be gone in 3 years anyways. But
So decisions to launch a dispute are complicated and take into account a lot of different considerations, and oftentimes also require considerable consultations with Canadian industry. And in some cases, Canadian industry is not necessarily unified in terms of their view as to whether or not Canada should launch a formal dispute. But certainly, I would agree that certainly registering the problem with a trading partner at a very early stage is really critical. Sometimes these issues can be resolved fairly quickly, including because sometimes governments are not even aware at the national level that these measures exist or could be potentially offside of a country's trade obligations. Sometimes it requires getting certain people in the room together. But certainly, I mean, we agree that, these issues have to be raised very early on. Sometimes we choose to do that through formal consultations at the WTO, which is a precursor to launching a formal panel. And in other cases, we have found good success in terms of doing it through other channels. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach, but we do take into consideration whether or not launching a formal dispute may serve to actually elevate the issue within a foreign government.
Okay. I think I'll leave it there, Chair.
Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to continue on from where I left off earlier, as well as piggyback on Mrs. Sarai's comments or questions, and where I was getting at with the appellate body. Frankly, when an appeal is brought to WTO, it does place a sense of vulnerability on sectors. With that, because of time, not only during, but afterwards as well, depending on the decision. And I guess the first question I was going to ask is what mechanisms are in place to overcome non-favorable WTO decisions that come down from the body and or contingency plans that we have in place to help sectors overcome some of those decisions. But the more I thought about it, I guess the more appropriate question would be, is do we actually need the body? Do we not? Well, look at NAFTA. We have a dispute settlement or dispute resolution as part of NAFTA. Would it not be more appropriate, more disciplined, more mature with respect to business and how to conduct business activity, and less arbitrary if, in fact, the body was dismantled, disentangled altogether, and what was actually encouraged? I'll use that word. I guess I don't want to get too strong of a word, so I'll use encouraged. That these arbitration arrangements, as we have here in interim fashion, will be once again encouraged within the association.
Chair, maybe I could start with the second question. So it's quite true that under our bilateral and regional FTAs, we have essentially a one-stage dispute settlement process. So there's no appeal mechanism. In the case of the WTO, there was a decision taken by members during the Uruguay round who felt that it would be important, as I mentioned earlier, but that we have a second level, just in case the panel didn't get it right the first time. I mean, that was really the primary purpose of adding that second level. I mean, I think it's a valid question in terms of whether or not we need a second stage of appeal. But certainly we have found good success at the WTO in terms of that two-stage process. And yes, it's true. There are certainly appellate body decisions that we would not necessarily fully agree with and wish maybe had gone in a slightly different direction. But we have seen a lot of value in that two-step process. And actually the reality is we have a very limited number of cases that we have pursued under our bilateral and regional FTAs in terms of state-to-state dispute settlement. And part of that is because of the two-stage system at the WTO. The other part of it is we also have the strength of other WTO members. And so there's a certain normative value as well in terms of those decisions. Your first question, sorry, I've now forgotten actually what your first question was. Chair, would it be okay if I ask the member just to repeat it?
Go ahead. Yes, you do.
It's with respect to
Earpiece.
over here.
Somebody's is close by.
Yeah.
Maybe it's.
Let's try that again. With respect to contingencies, are there contingencies in place if, in fact, or during, as well as after the fact, with respect to the different sectors that are being affected?
Le son empêche les interprètes de faire leur travail. Est-ce qu'on peut attendre quelques instants? Les interprètes sont tannés et ils ont raison. Hein?
Is the mic wrong? Do we need to change a different microphone?
It's the feedback when you put down the earpieces. The feedback when you put down the earpieces goes right through our skulls. You either turn the volume down on the earpiece, simply turn the volume down on the earpiece. When you're not using them, please turn the volume down on the earpiece.
À mon écouteur.
No, it's because of the interference with the earpieces. So if you just turn the volume down on the earpiece, you don't get the squeal.
You answered anyway. Go ahead.
I think so. Just going back to the question on contingency measures and how we implement adverse decisions. So, like other countries, we have a process, and usually after an adverse decision at the WTO, there is a negotiated reasonable period of time done at the WTO to implement that decision. And that's also an opportunity to work with the opposing party to determine an appropriate route from where the measure is to where it needs to get to be compliant with Canada's WTO obligations.
If they don't retaliate.
Well, even after an adverse decision, you have a negotiated period of time in which you have to come into compliance with that decision. And so that's the period of time in which we work with industry, we work with the opposing party to identify a road forward that is compliant with the rules. And that can be either implemented by a subsequent decision of whether it's compliant or not at the WTO, or it can be implemented as a mutually agreed solution with the other party.
However, under Article 17 of the Rules and Procedures, they have an opportunity or a mechanism in place built in for retaliation at any time, correct?
That only takes effect after there has been an arbitration on the level of concessions that they are able to withdraw. So there is, from the time that you actually are found offside the rules, there is an initial period called the reasonable period of time to come into compliance. And during that period of time, they can't retaliate.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2 minutes.
Pour 2 minutes.
Well, 2 minutes. In which case, I asked a question earlier and I run out of time, so I was get caught off. Basically, it was on the current negotiations as to e-trade, electronic digital. Will there be more power to the major digital companies? I did hear you say that data collection was an issue also, but will this loosening up will give more power in the hands of the mega digital companies who are heads above everyone else in the economic or digital trade?
When we look at the work that we're doing in the WTO, along with any other trade agreement, we are looking at creating a level playing field for all companies. And in fact, the work that we do in terms of increasing certainty and predictability in our trade agreement outcomes pertaining to digital, actually the greatest beneficiaries are in fact small and medium-sized enterprises, because they're the ones that cannot bear the type of administrative burdens and costs associated with some of the complex rules that are applicable to digital trade, and rules that, and barriers that could exist in certain foreign jurisdictions. And it includes issues like limitations on cross-border data flows, or data localization requirements, or thirdly, maybe requirements on the disclosure of source code. So I would take your question in the sense that there's going to be, I think, an ongoing debate in society, and not only in Canada but in other countries, as to what is the role that some of these big companies play. But these are not some of the types of considerations that we would tackle in the context of a trade agreement. We simply are looking for creating a level playing field for all companies, domestic and foreign, with respect to what takes place in the realm of digital trade. And as I said, we are tackling issues that, in our belief, will actually give priority benefit to SMEs.
Yeah, I mean, I find the comment interesting just because I think we did hear a lot of testimony in the study of CUSMA that suggests otherwise, which is that actually what was put in CUSMA is going to benefit the existing large web giants that are predominantly located in the United States, and that what's in CUSMA kind of forecloses a lot of policy option debates within Canada. So, I mean, to hear that, I don't think it's just a simple matter of, trying to level the playing field, because we heard very clearly that some of the provisions you're talking about it's not a level playing field right now, and that those rules are to the benefit of the established players. And that while it may be a level playing field on paper, in practice, it's not going to establish a level playing field, because you already have major players who have serious assets that they can use to perpetuate their position within the industry. And then it may actually be a serious barrier to entry to the industry for smaller players, as those larger players are allowed to continue to use their existing advantage against entry. And that seems to be, I mean, if you look at a company like, Microsoft and Apple, for instance, particularly maybe Microsoft. I mean, that seems to be the business model, actually, is to use their existing size and clout to keep smaller players out of the market, or to only allow them to participate as startups that then, once they start to do something that could challenge the position of that larger company, are then bought out and kind of assimilated into those companies. So, for what it's worth, a word of caution there. I mean, it sounds great to say we're just trying to level the playing field, but I'm not convinced that that's actually what's going on when we enshrine these kinds of rules. And I do think that Canadians have a right to a meaningful policy debate that's being circumvented by the government, first of all in CUSMA, and I'm concerned that that's happening, and that Canada is a proponent of circumventing our right to a domestic debate by already taking bullish action on these types of things at the international trade table. So I don't know if I've used all my time.
You have 15 seconds for an answer.
Okay, because I wanted to start on a new line of questioning, but I'll have to foreclose on that for now. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Again, I would say that the work that we do is again reflective of our domestic regime, and we're also basing our activities on the work of extensive consultations with Canadian stakeholders, industry, civil society, organized labor. We certainly have, as I said, put all our proposals out on the table, and we'd welcome further comments and insights from all Canadians on the work we're doing.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Carey, you indicated you had a short question that you wanted to throw out there.
Yeah, just while you're here, from a world trade perspective, if a country wants to protect a certain industry, like I come from Oshawa, it's an auto industry, and you want to move ahead with future trade agreements, and you decide we want to protect this one particular sector, what does it do to Canada's negotiating ability, or a particular country's ability to actually get first involved in trade agreements, and does it put you at a disadvantage as far as negotiation if you go into these discussions with that type of mindset? Are you able to comment on that?
Chair, I'm just actually wondering if the question can be slightly clarified. Is the question whether or not Canada's ability to negotiate is impaired by a need to protect a particular industry, or is the question more about Canada's ability to seek successful outcomes if another country is protecting an industry?
If Canada decides to protect an industry. First one.
You know what? I mean, I've been negotiating trade agreements for probably 20 years, and I don't think I've ever been part of a negotiation where we haven't had sensitivities that we have to protect. Mm-hmm. We are not a duty-free port like Singapore or Hong Kong, for example. And so whether, we are protecting key sectors like our supply managed sectors, our automotive sector, our cultural industries. I mean, I've just given some examples of sensitivities. That has always been part of our negotiating strategy. And our interest is to try to negotiate the best possible outcomes for Canadians. And we certainly do our best to try to protect our sensitivities in the negotiations. Obviously, at the end of the day, the results of our negotiations are a negotiated outcome. But, I think that is something that certainly we are accustomed to. And the reality is there are very few countries in the world that don't have something to protect.
Okay, thanks.
Right. You've completed the third round. Mr. Raya?
Just one question, if I may.
Please, go ahead.
I know we have signed agreements with the 14 countries covering 51% of the population. Still, bulk of the trade is with the North American countries, US and Mexico. Are we still going ahead with chasing few more trade agreements, or are we consolidating what we have now?
So, Chair, again, maybe because this question is outside of the WTO, I'll ask whether you'd like me to answer that. I can in the role that I have.
If you would like to take an opportunity to attempt to, but we won't hold you to the answer as being 100% accurate.
Sure. Well, I mean, as Director for Trade Negotiations, I'm responsible not only for our engagement at the WTO, but also our bilateral and regional free trade negotiations. So I'm happy to take the question. We are in the process of negotiating several free trade agreements, including with the Mercosur bloc of countries, which includes Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. We're also engaged in negotiations with the Pacific Alliance bloc of countries, which is Chile, Mexico, Colombia, and Peru. In addition to those two negotiations, we're also exploring the possibility of launching negotiations with ASEAN in Southeast Asia, and have also recently initiated public consultations with Canadians on possible modernization of our free trade agreement with Ukraine. So these are some of the initiatives that are currently underway.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much to our witnesses. We appreciate all the great knowledge that you've shared with us today. Right. So the witnesses can leave. I need to ask a question of the committee for a moment. Currently, the routine is that witnesses speak for 10 minutes. We can reduce that to 5 minutes if the committee would prefer that, just to give us more time for questions. Is that something that... Let them speak for 10?
That's my
Okay,
concern.
and just to let you know that does the committee agree that the briefs for the WTO study should be a maximum of 2,000 words and the deadline should be set for Monday, March 30th? That's pretty normal, so I assume everyone is good with that. Okay, fine. All right, okay. That's it. We've done what we had to do today and move adjournment.